there are 5 big mistakes you can be making in Diablo 4's endgame, and if you've been struggling, whether it's with your barb, whether it's with another character, not only just getting to the endgame, but mastering it and mastering high levels of the pit, building out a character that can tank and finish a lot of the in-game content, I'm going to show you the 5 most common things that me and other players have run into that is really holding your character back in Season 4. If you watch the full video, hopefully you'll learn one or a couple things that can really help boost your character's power. So the first main things is specific defensive stats, specifically regarding max life. Now, if you're anything familiar with Diablo in any of the seasons, you realize, especially now with the pit and harder in-game content, you need as much life as you can possibly get. Now, there's a couple main things you should be paying attention to for your gear, skills, and Paragon board, making sure you can max out the highest max life that you can possibly get. Now, even currently right here, I only have 58,000 life, but you can get easily up to 150k or sometimes even 200,000, depending on if you set your build up correctly. The first main thing with max life is once you hit the end game, obviously your greater affixes for your gear are important, but they're a little bit more important than you think to actually have on specific pieces of gear. For instance, this pair of pants, you can see I currently have a 149 strength greater affix on my pants. Great for my damage, great overall for like armor, etc., stuff like that, right? It's a good stat to have a greater affix for. But once you get to the end game, we're trying to make our max life as high as humanly possible. Why? So that way we're much more tanky while running levels of the pit, but also the more health you have, the bigger high hitting attacks, such as like the fireball explosion or other boss attacks that you can actually tank if you have enough health. For instance, if something hits you for 60k and you only have 40k, you're done, right? But if you have 80k health, you can tank that big hit in case you don't dodge a mechanic, and it allows you to survive and beat content much easier. Now, back to the gear itself. So for our pants, it's great that we have a greater affix for strength, but really for every single piece of gear we have, almost all of them, we want greater affixes on our max life because it's the one key thing that keeps us alive in the end game. So for example, would I choose late game to have a set of pants that had 149 strength as a greater affix versus if I found another pair of pants that had a greater affix for maximum life? You would always want to pick max life because you do enough damage in most of the seasons, especially Season 4. However, you need the max life over a lot of damage, and it's worth trading in the long run. So again, with all of our pieces of gear, as you get greater affixes like our Harlequin's crest here, you can see we have a greater affix for max life, and in the long run with a bunch of our gear and gems, this base value, even though it doesn't seem like a lot, it's only a 300, 400, 500 difference in some cases, ends up actually getting boosted by these percentages with our gems and other gear that boosts our max life and ends up becoming a much bigger difference than you think. A 300 max life difference on our gear, whether it's a bad roll or a greater affix, could end up being thousands and thousands of health once all the other stuff is accounted for. So make sure you have that maxed out as much as possible. Now, again, we need to make sure our gems, especially our red gems, are slotted on all of our stuff, and we're getting the most amount of gems as possible. Now, some of you have been struggling with these scattered prisms. You have to do the world bosses, otherwise you're gonna struggle with getting these pieces, or otherwise you're gonna struggle with getting your gear slotted out with sockets. You have to make sure you do them, as well as the butcher. I noticed the butcher drops scattered prisms as well. And as you can see, once you get this set up for one character, starting to stack these for other characters becomes much easier, and I currently have 10. Focus on enough world bosses and you will get plenty of these as long as you make sure to do them. Now, one more touch on some really big mistakes that you can make for max life is building out your Paragon board. So specifically, a couple different things with the Paragon board. Most all Paragon boards are going to have big max life buffs like this, where we get 4% max life, 2% max life as additional other magic nodes, and you want to make sure you take these as much as possible toward the end game, even if that means, again, giving up some specific pieces, even if that again means giving up some specific damage nodes for max life itself, because again, it's one of our most important stats later in the game. For instance, I previously had nodes down here for physical damage, strength, other physical damage, etc., but I ended up swapping those out in this board so I could come up here and actually grab 4% max life and the additional other 2%, giving me an additional 8% max life there. You have to be doing that if you want to survive very easily in the late game. Now, one important thing that I'll touch on also in a little bit with max life is you need to pay attention to how you're selecting your boards. For instance, this last board that you can see, this is our, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th board that we finally selected, and we're just coming down here to get the max life, which we get a total of 14% max life from. Now, this is where board selection is key, because if you're not used to paying attention to these boards, for instance, you just place boards how a build guide has it or whatever, it's specifically important you place them in a specific order for a reason. For instance, we're playing a barbarian here, so we know we're going to have maximum possible strength on a barb build. That's why we saved this board for the end, because it costs 980 strength to get the additional 4% max life, and this goes the same for other nodes as well. So we know we're going to be able to qualify for this by putting it on our last board. Now, let's say instead we put it on, I don't know, the second board over here. The second board, you can see like this node costs 260 willpower, or it would cost 260 strength if we were to do that board right here. Now, we would still get the max life from the other board, but then when we went to use this board in our 7th slot, it would cost us 960 willpower or so just to qualify for the additional resistance bonus. The same goes for this node, this node, this node, and this node, meaning we would no longer qualify for that max life because it requires like 900 plus willpower, and we're not going to have that. That's why selecting your Paragon boards in a specific order, meaning the ones that you can qualify for with your other stats, being further up to the front, and other ones like stats you have a ton of being farther towards the back, so you can make sure you get both the bonuses from all the nodes at the beginning Paragon boards and at the end as well. If you do that and stack greater affixes for max life, all of your gems maxed out on your gear, and your Paragon board for max life points, as well as potentially even your skill tree. Again, the Barbarian has things like Imposing Presence that gives us 18% additional max life, that you can actually get pieces of this on gear. For instance, looks like your amulet or your pants or something, so that way you can bump this up by another 3 points, doubling us up, giving us 36 additional percent max life. That's another thing you want to keep in mind. But as if you do all 4 of those things, you will have so much max life. Nothing can one-shot you just about in the entire game. Much easier, and this is probably the one big mistake that a lot of players currently make. Next is focused around DR. So DR is specifically important because not only are there a lot of sources of DR, but you want to make sure you're stacking it appropriately, because just because you have DR, you think you have it in a certain way, doesn't necessarily make it effective. For instance, we get damage reduction from a bunch of different sources. Ideally, some of the big sources are going to be aspects. So aspects like the aspect of might. So our basic skills grant us 20% damage reduction. In this build, we're using the bash skill, meaning we're using a basic skill all of the time, allowing us to keep up 20% DR every single second, except for when we first run into battle. We have to hit an enemy in order to proc it. So you need to make sure you're hitting that and knowing your aspects and how to proc them for damage reduction to get them up and running, because if you don't get them procced before you get hit one time, sometimes in later game like pit levels 120 or plus, if you don't proc these immediately and get hit by 1 or 2 enemies before you do, you will die and there's nothing you can do about it. So you need to make sure you understand how that works. Additionally, you need to make sure you pay attention to uniques for your class as well, because uniques for your class will give you 2 different sets of damage reduction. To give you an example, some of the unique gear we have right here, if we look at, for instance, Yin's Blessing Boots, they actually give 9.8% damage reduction from close enemies. Now, this specifically, again, gives us damage reduction when enemies are close or in our vicinity. Now, one of the big things with this is, again, this is a category of damage reduction specifically. So typically, most of the time you meet these criteria, you want to make sure you stack that specific damage reduction as much as possible. Again, as a barb, we're going to be close against enemies very often, so we need to make sure we're specifically using gear that stacks damage reduction from close enemies. As well, we're going to also proc bleeding on enemies, so we have 33% here. Between the two, we have a solid damage reduction percentage on almost every single enemy, and we'll be making every enemy bleed as soon as they touch us, meaning we're constantly using this DR against every single enemy we fight. It's important that you're using those specific type of damage reduction instead of things like damage reduction from distant. Yeah, that's a great skill, but what's better, to have 15% damage reduction from close and 15 from distant, or is it better to have 25% from close, which you're using all the time nonstop, and 5 distant, because the distant we don't really necessarily need, because remember, when enemies hit us, automatically causes them to bleed, so we automatically get the 33% from bleeding, making distance pretty much irrelevant. So you want to make sure you're stacking those. But another thing with damage reduction, you also want to consider the other pieces of gear like Harlequin Crest, which is going to give us basic flat damage reduction across the board. These are why these Uber uniques are so specifically good, because again, they give us flat damage reduction, meaning we get damage reduction period. It doesn't matter if it's from close, from distance, from far away. This is going to be the thing that allows us to stay alive in the late game very, very consistently just by wearing one helmet and doing nothing else to it. That's why farming the Uber uniques are specifically important, and honestly with Season 4, they've been fairly easy to get from the tormented version of Duriel. Find a group or run it solo once your build is strong enough, and this kind of gear takes you literally to the next level. Now again, while we're talking about damage reduction, you get damage reduction obviously from specific skills that you have. Just to give you an example, we get 6% damage reduction from distant right here, and other skills will give you other spots of damage reduction. And you need to make sure you're using a lot of damage reduction skills specifically in your build, or at least one primary source, because in the late game you need one or two different options to stay alive almost all of the time, unless you have an insane amount of health or 50 or 60k plus max life. Then you can get away with generally one skill that gives us damage reduction. And another thing, the Paragon board, again, like I mentioned earlier, to make sure you take your nodes or your specific Paragon boards in the correct order, give us a lot of different damage reduction. I'm just going to show you an example. So for instance, in this build, and I just haven't wanted to redo my Paragon board, I took this board at slot number 4. So this board right here, you can see costs 450 willpower. We get 4% damage reduction from bleeding, but an additional 4% because we meet that threshold. Your nodes like these are going to give you your biggest sets of damage reduction probably for your character overall, period. So that's why you need to pay attention to when you take these, and take the boards for damage reduction early, as well as making sure you take a lot of glyphs late game, or primarily things like the territorial glyph, where again it just says we straight up get 10% damage reduction against close enemies if we meet the additional bonus. Now again, since I took this board up here 5th, that means our damage reduction from bleeding here has, instead of a 460 willpower requirement, a 540 willpower requirement, meaning we don't get this damage from bleeding enemies. Now, again, the big thing to mention here, and this is my fault for my build because I haven't went back and redone it yet, you get the bonus from this node and this node because they're lower tier or they have lower requirements. Now this board up here, I'm missing this one, I'm missing this one by just a bit, I'm missing this one, and I'm missing this one. Now, if I were to put this board at number 4 and the bottom one at number 5, I would be getting all 4 of these bonuses, and I would be getting, again, 4 bonuses instead of the 2 I'm getting down here. You catch my drift? It gives you a lot more bonuses, makes you more powerful, which is why your board selection and the order you put them in is very important. Now, next is going to be the big crafting mistakes that people make towards the end game that are costing them a ton of time, a ton of gold, and overall just making you farm much, much more. So if you stop doing this, you'll definitely save a decent amount of time. Now, there's a specific order that's the best order to really start working on your gear. From level 0 to 100, you should pretty much be focusing on just replacing the best gear that you find with your current gear and not worrying about really what's on it. Yeah, you can temper some stuff or put some aspects on it if it makes your gear much more powerful early to help you level much quicker, but you shouldn't be focusing on that in-game gear yet because you're going to waste a lot of materials tempering, a lot of gold tempering and enchanting and all this stuff, and it's not worth it. You should go up until you get to about around level 80 or 90. Once you get to maybe, let's say, level 85, that's when you should look and start understanding and kind of write down or follow a build guide on what stats you need on your gear. At that point, from level 85 and above, once you start getting all 925 item power gear, then you want to go ahead and start grabbing the ancestral gear that you can find. If it has stats that match up or stats that you can actually re-enchant one and actually have a chance to make it a solid piece of gear, that's when you want to go ahead and start saving them. You can see I have a bunch saved up here for my barbarian. You can see I have literally 2 rows, especially the ones with greater affixes. And it's important you go ahead and do this because if you don't do it, you're going to hit a later level. You're going to say, I'm going to need a sword with strength, crit strike damage, and maximum life, but I don't have one. And now by doing this, I have a ton of options. So if I want to change a sword or part of my build, I just come in here, grab a sword that I've saved because I know it has all the stats I can use on it. And then I just re-enchant one of the stats to what I want. And then I go ahead and temper it and stuff and then re-enchant the stat to what I want it to be. And boom, I have a brand new piece of gear because I've been saving this gear. Now, the big mistake people are making with their gear is you should follow this specific order to upgrade your gear. So let's say we get a piece of gear that we like. Let's just say we take this mace right here, strength, max life, and vulnerable damage. Let's say this is the perfect mace right now, because those are the only 3 stats we need to be concerned with because we can change everything else. Now, the vulnerable damage, let's say we want that to be crit strike damage. This is the order you should follow to save your mats and your sanity. So here we should go ahead and jump in here to the blacksmith. and we should temper the item first. It's important you temper it first, because if you do a bunch of other things to the item and waste a bunch and use a bunch of money and gold and resources, etc., then you can go in here and temper the item and essentially brick it out of existence and not be able to use it. So we should ideally come in here and temper it with whatever we're going to temper it with first. Let's say we got whatever we wanted. Great damage with 200 slashing weapons. That's trash, but let's just say that's what we wanted. And then we come in here and then we come over here and temper the other affix. And let's say, boom, we got exactly what we wanted. We don't need to retemper this anymore. Now this item is in business. So what we're going to do is take it. We're then going to be able to come over to the occultist and go ahead and actually worry about enchanting the item. Once you've first tempered your gear and it's perfect, then once you've enchanted your gear and gotten the right affixes on it, at that point you can jump in here and finally use the Codex of Power to enchant it with the proper aspect. And then once you've done that, you can then come over and masterwork for the final step. And that's when you can begin masterworking your gear. If it's a perfect piece of gear, start masterworking that thing up and up and up as high as it can go. Now in the pit, obviously you keep getting masterworking materials. And this is another big mistake that I kind of made earlier on. You don't have to repeat the lower levels of the pit to keep getting masterworking materials. You can actually continue to do higher levels of the pit and then trade in that stuff as crafting material right here. So that way if I run one higher level dungeon and get 60 net iron, I can then come in here and trade it in. And if I do, let's say 60 here, I will get 180 ingolith versus if I did a normal dungeon that gives me ingolith, I would maybe only get 40 or so. So it gives you much more doing it this way, and it doesn't really cost that much gold at all to do that. So you need to make sure you're doing that to max out your materials. Additionally, if you have an alt, you can run the pit on an alt if you want, but ideally, if you want to go ahead and boost up your alt character very fast, you can go ahead and run the pit with your primary character, give a ton of resources this way, and then by the time you get, let's say, do enough dungeons and you get 200 net iron, you can trade it in for all the obdicite and ingolith you want to upgrade your alt's character and masterwork, all of that gear up to levels 4, 6, or 8, just from a few pit runs from your higher level character instead of going step by step. And again, it's long and good. It takes long enough to farm the masterworking materials as it is. But again, it's important that if you really want to masterwork your gear, unless you're having specific problems touching or doing specific in-game content, not really worrying about masterworking at all that high level unless the gear is perfect. By all means, you can continue to do that to push higher tiers, which is what you should do, but don't stress on doing those levels 8, 9, 10, 11, etc. if your gear is anything less than either perfect or really good, or it's just messed up, all the affixes are wrong. Don't masterwork that gear. It's a waste of resources because eventually you'll find the right gear, and it actually costs 5 million gold to get rid of or reset your masterworking ranks, which is a lot of gold at this point in the game. So make sure you're sure about your gear before you start masterworking it to those high level tiers. Now, this is another key thing that I'm going to loop into these crafting mistakes because again, this is an important one. So for instance, for this mace, we're looking for critical strike damage. So at this point, we can go ahead and enchant this thing to try and get critical strike damage. And the good thing is with enchanting, we can try as many times as we like, over and over and over until we eventually get it, even though it will cost us a ton of gold to do it this way. But again, unless you don't have an item that has all 3 affixes, you're going to have to do this. The one key trick with this is trying to make sure you pay attention and find specific items that give us very specific affixes. For instance, on the mace, you can see when we click on vulnerable damage, this is the pool of affixes we can actually grab from. Now, if we were to replace strength, you can see that pool of affixes is actually different. Is again, strength gives us this pool for this specific slot. If we re-roll strength, we're not going to get crit strike damage. You have to make sure that it's in this list of possible affixes. So if we re-roll vulnerable damage, we can get crit strike damage. But if we do strength or max life, you're going to sit there and re-roll that and roll it and spend millions and 10 millions and 20 millions of gold and never get it because you didn't look at this menu, because some of these slots give you specific things and are different. Now, the other big mistake people are making with enchanting and wasting a bunch of money is you can see how many slots there are for this specific possible affix for crit strike damage, meaning there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We got a 2 out of 7 chance every time we enchant this item. So if we enchant it, let's say we go ahead and do that. You can see we didn't get it here. Well, it's fine. We keep on re-rolling it. But this is where you want to pay attention to the gear that you find, because ideally you should be looking for something that already has 2 affixes, one of those being crit strike damage because it's a more rare affix. Why? Because if you have crit strike damage and let's say strength and you're missing a max life and strength are an affix that roll very easy. Their roll chances are much higher. You can basically re-roll this and get strength or max life if the item doesn't have it on it in the first roll, which is why we should be looking for crit strike damage instead of maximum life or strength. We should make sure we have 2 of the 3 on there, but one has to be crit strike damage. So to give you another quick example, if we actually go to enchant this pair of gloves, now this pair of gloves has +3 to upheaval. That is a rare stat that you should find on the piece of gear instead of trying to roll it. Why? Because if we look at strength again, we have a bunch of affixes we can actually roll here. And if we look at critical strike chance, we have a bunch of affixes we can roll here. But then if we look at +3 to upheaval, again, we have an even bigger list. So after counting these up, this is 23 possible total affixes you can roll. So it gives you a 2 out of 23 chance. And at $1 million or 2 million gold a roll, those odds are trash. You're going to spend tens of millions of gold trying to roll this thing and probably not even get it. Which again is why we should be looking for this affix on our gear first, paired with another affix we want like crit strike chance or strength. If we get those 2, then we put the piece of gear aside to possibly put on later. But if we don't get upheaval and we just get crit strike chance and strength, it's not worth even keeping because you're going to have to roll this thing 500 million times to get this actual stat if you are lucky enough. And again, some of these stats roll at a much higher percentage than upheaval, so your chances are really even worse than what I'm telling you. Again, focus on getting the rare affixes on your gear. If you have those and you have at least 2 of 3 and one of them is one of the rare affixes, you can always re-roll the third affix to one of the common ones that you need, like strength or max life, or again, any of the typical ones you would find for your normal class. And the last big mistake is taking your time to go ahead and farm early, because it's important, because otherwise you're going to feel so behind, like you're lost, like you're progressing one step at a time. And that just slows down your progression dramatically. So you need to make sure you're farming out the stuff you need in big chunks so that way you have enough to work with. For instance, some of the big things like the regular materials like failed crystals and iron chunks, you need to make sure you're running content like the hell tides, consistently coming back and salvaging all of those items with the blacksmith, so that way you can build up a stockpile of those materials. Why? Because now that I've built up a stockpile, I am so thankful I did it, because now I can upgrade to whatever I want to do. And all I have to worry about is gold, and it's no big deal. I can do whatever I want with whatever character I want. This is one of the things that's really going to speed up your progression and help you later in the game. Now, another big thing is running things like hell tides, again, because getting things like angel breath from hell tides is also extremely important. And why is that? Specifically because when you go to the occultist, let's say we want to enchant an item, it's going to cost as well as other crafting sources. So you need to make sure you have enough of that specifically, so that way you don't run out. And angel breath specifically is one of the things I struggle with, because I'm constantly building this, and I'm constantly building the anti-venom potions and incense for my other characters or alt characters to level them quickly. And you run out of it quickly if you have not farmed any, which is why Helltide is so good, because you can farm all the regular mats and angel breath at the exact same time. And the same goes for farming whispers. I have a video on my channel already about how to get the most gold in the game, but every time you max out your whisper to 100%, so you can come here and get a greater cache or get one of the regular ones. And again, open that thing up and get some gear, but also primarily get the gold from it, because you can get 10 million gold from a whisper cache, which makes it very, very good for gold gain. And again, if you don't do this while you're playing, you're going to have to go do it after the fact, and you're going to be leaving a lot of gold on the table, which you then have to go back and farm later. If you follow all those tips, you should have no problem mastering the end game in Diablo Season 4. If this video helped you, drop a like on the video, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.